Lee Kuan Yew further warned us back then that if we didn't make the necessary changes, the Philippines will lag even further behind. Even Vietnam will overtake the Philippines. Well, guess what? Vietnam already overtook us in terms of GDP per capita back in the latter half of 2021. When exactly are we going to make these necessary systemic changes so that our society can start to zoom upwards? Okay, I'm sure everyone is very much impressed in Singapore. They used to be a third world country with a huge number of poor people, many of them barely educated. Then they worked themselves up to become an extremely rich first world country in just 30 years, all thanks to the vision and hard work of Singapore's late founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and his team.
The Philippines can pull itself together and get on with the job. And it has a good chance of success because it is part of a region which is set for high growth.
Just to put things in perspective of the magnitude of Singapore's growth over the past 20 years, here's Singapore in red compared to the US and Japan. So how can the Philippines become rich and successful just like Singapore? Learn from Lee Kuan Yew lah. Now, what if I told you that back in November of 1992, Lee Kuan Yew visited the Philippines to give us some free tips on how we could also become a rich and successful country just like Singapore? I'm talking about that famous speech he gave to the Philippine Business Conference where he said, "I do not believe that democracy necessarily leads to development. I believe that what a country needs to develop is discipline more than democracy." But unfortunately, it seems that's the only thing that so many Filipinos remember him saying. People forget that he actually did give us some very solid and specific tips on what we need to fix and change in our policies and systems in order to succeed. And he believed it was totally possible for us to succeed because we had and still have several advantages going for us as a people. For instance, he said, there are more MBAs in the Philippines than in any ASEAN country, both Filipino and US trained. Filipinos are fluent in English and the use of English is widespread. These factors are good for development. Lee Kuan Yew said that we need to dismantle economic protectionism in the Philippines. He said, it has to be systematic with a publicly announced timetable during which the protective barriers enjoyed by the industrial and services sectors will be dismantled and foreign competitors allowed in. Then you will find that Filipinos can perform just as well as Singaporeans or Thais or Malaysians. If the Philippines sticks to old policies because vested interests are too powerful to overturn, then Filipinos will continue to lag further and further behind our ASEAN neighbors. He shared about how the rapid economic development of Singapore was fueled by the aggressive attraction of foreign direct investments and multinational corporations. These international investors and global companies went into Singapore and created lots and lots of jobs. And these companies competed against each other to attract workers by offering better salaries. Other countries in the ASEAN region, particularly Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, copied Singapore's strategy of aggressively bringing in foreign direct investors. They too ended up solving their unemployment problems and improved their economies. As more and more people got employed and earned good wages, more people paid taxes, and their governments earned more tax revenue. These governments could now spend that increased tax revenue on further improving their overall infrastructure, building more roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, and paying better wages to government workers and officials, and thus bring corruption levels down. This again made them even more attractive to foreign investors, and the process was repeated over and over again. This is what Singapore did. This is why Singapore became a first world country. And this is what everyone else in the region, and even gigantic China, did. They learned from Singapore's experience and succeeded as a result of emulating many of Singapore's economic policies, especially when it came to attracting foreign investors. Lee Kuan Yew was telling us Filipinos in his 1992 speech that we needed to do everything to turn our country into a very attractive investment location. Removing those economic restrictions of the Constitution against foreign direct investors, especially those 60-40 equity restrictions, was absolutely necessary if we were serious about solving our massive chronic unemployment problem that has continued to force millions of our people to seek jobs abroad and be away from their families back in the Philippines. Do take a look at this chart and see the impact of Lee's leadership. His exact words were, first, restore law and order. Make Manila safe from organized kidnapping and major crimes. Second, concentrate on economics, not politics, or more accurately, politicking. Lift restrictions on trade and investment. Dismantle the web of measures which keep out foreign companies and make Philippine companies compete to survive, not thrive at the expense of ordinary Filipinos. Third, build up your infrastructure, like power stations, roads, and communications, either in partnership with or completely by the private sector. Lee Kuan Yew also mentioned that we are sadly being held back by our presidential system when he said the following: one problem is the Philippines has an American-style constitution, one of the most difficult to operate in the world. There is a complete separation of powers between executive, legislature, and judiciary. A US-style constitution failed long before Marcos declared martial law. It was readopted in 1987 by President Aquino. The system worked in America because of a superabundance of resources and riches in a vast, underpopulated continent. I do not believe that Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Singapore could have succeeded as they have done if they had to work under such a constitution, where gridlock on every major issue is a way of life. And you will notice that since the Vietnam War and the Great Society for some 28 years ago, the US system has not functioned even for the United States. There is absolutely no assurance that the American-style constitution will produce wealth for the Philippines as it has for America. Filipinos have no empty, wealthy continent to make them rich. They have a densely populated archipelago with little oil, gas, or other valuable natural resources. Now, to be sure, I did some extra research and found two different papers, one by two political scientists, Drs. Gehring and Thacker of Boston University, and the other paper by three economists, Drs. Loaiza, Lederman, and Suarez, that show that presidential systems are much more prone to corruption and inefficiency when compared against parliamentary systems, all other things being equal. I found another paper by two economists, Drs. Oskin and McManus, which showed that parliamentary systems tend to produce superior economic outcomes when compared against presidential systems. They later turned this into a book called Why Are Presidential Regimes Bad for the Economy? There is, in fact, a huge plethora of research papers written by so many world-renowned political scientists like Drs. Leibhardt, Maywaring, Skok, Stepan, Riggs, Lintz, and so many more, which prove that presidential systems are generally much more problematic than parliamentary systems, all other things being equal. So Lee Kuan Yew was totally right. Our presidential system is indeed holding us back. I wouldn't be surprised if it was thanks to Lee Kuan Yew's free advice in that 1992 speech that the Ramos administration, back in the 1990s, tried to pursue constitutional reforms aimed at removing the anti-foreign direct investment restrictions in the Constitution and shifting over to a parliamentary system. But anyway, I've actually heard some Singaporeans ask me, but how can you copy Singapore? Singapore's so small one. Philippines is 400 times bigger than Singapore. Well, we can adopt the gradualist structure of evolving federalism, subdividing the Philippines into more easily manageable autonomous regions so that each region can be empowered to emulate Singapore's economic and developmental policies at that level. All administrations since Ramos, except for the Noynoy Aquino administration, have all pursued constitutional reform. The current administration has tried pursuing it too. Unfortunately, none of these efforts have so far succeeded because of a pervasive, false narrative that has long dominated Philippine mainstream mass media and the grapevine. It continues to dupe and mislead many Filipinos into thinking that the 1987 Constitution is fine and needs no improvement, including that false claim that constitutional reform is all about term extension. It's just sad because the Philippines is the only country in the world that has explicit 60-40 and other anti-FDI restrictions spelled out in the constitution. Other countries only have their restrictions in legislation, not in their constitutions. And thanks to that, we are the third most restrictive country against FDI in the world, according to the OECD FDI Restrictiveness Index, behind Libya and the Palestinian Authority. To this day, we still haven't been able to get the anti-foreign direct investment restrictions in the 1987 Constitution removed, or at the very least, loosened. To this day, we still suffer the negative effects of our personality-focused, inefficient, and gridlock-prone presidential system. Lee Kuan Yew already advised us to fix these problems way back in 1992, and until today, we still haven't been able to fix them. Lee Kuan Yew said, "Every Filipino knows the other ASEAN countries have overtaken the Philippines." He further warned us back then that if we didn't make the necessary changes, the Philippines will lag even further behind. Even Vietnam will overtake the Philippines, and Filipinos cannot blame others for it. Well, guess what? Vietnam already overtook us in terms of GDP per capita back in the latter half of 2021. So folks, when exactly are we going to make these necessary systemic changes so that our society can start to zoom upwards? Are we waiting for Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Timor-Leste to overtake us before we finally make those changes that Lee Kuan Yew said we needed to make back in 1992? Come on, guys. Let's correct the Constitution. My name is Orion Perez, and this is PGMN.
If I were a Filipino, I would count my blessings and start in a positive frame of mind.